So I want to talk a little bit about reaching level 100, some things that kind of continuously pop up for Diablo 4, and all of them are reasonable criticisms of the game, but specifically for the grind to 100. Now, this is actually a pretty relevant topic because in a couple of days, we're actually going to get a monster density buff. And if they don't adjust the experience levels for just the straight up monsters in these dungeons, well, it should be about a 30 to 40% increase in XP rates for these dungeons. And if you're running in a group, that could be like 30 million up to now 40 million or so, which will be a big bonus. If you're a solo, well, hopefully you'll go from like 15, 20 million to 25, maybe 28 million or so, something like that. But that's going to be a big bonus getting to level 100. But that's not necessarily enough for most players. Now, there's a few different types of players when we're considering getting to level 100. There are the people that just love the grind. They love improving the character. They love completing goals. They love reaching level 100. That is always going to be the case in every game. You're always going to have that dedicated player base that just wants to complete it for the sake of completing it, or wants to be a part of the community for the sake of doing the activity. However, there are a lot of people that jump into this game and they've kind of come to the realization that Diablo 4 isn't really that deep in terms of content. In fact, it's one of the more shallow games. It kind of reminds me of a little bit of Diablo 3 in that you run bounties, you go ahead and you run greater rifts. That's basically it. That's all you're doing in Diablo 3. And in Diablo 4, well, you run your renown, usually to level, and then you run nightmare dungeons. That's it. Now, that's not doesn't mean that there's not depth to the game. There's depth to the Paragon, there's depth to the boards, there's depth to a lot of other activities or parts of the game. I guess I shouldn't say activities, mainly towards building your character. And you could say that there's less depth than other games, sure. But in terms of actual content in Diablo 4, there really isn't much to be confused about or to be interested in doing. And that means that you're doing the same thing over and over again. And because Diablo 4 had the MMO aspects, because it's the release of like a decade, it's one of the most popular released games as of releasing, you pulled in a ton of people that were not used to the ARPG grind. And ARPGs are notoriously grindy and they're notoriously kind of repeating the same content. This is just something that's kind of typical. However, when you consider Diablo 4 in specific, you have, well, the ARPG aspect, which is just I'm going to grind for minute improvements to my gear, try to get these drops, try to get these different things, and then you're going to move on, right? But you're doing that, but also without any sort of variability in content, because a lot of the nightmare dungeons, well, they're basically the same thing. And then also, you don't even want to run most of the nightmare dungeons because they just aren't good. And a lot of people are coming to the realization of this. For example, here, I don't think I'll ever hit level 100. I've played the past few weeks for several hours a day, which is a lot of time, by the way. Tried different characters to see how they would play like. Yesterday, I started a new Necro. I tried to level as quickly as possible, and man, that is a bore. It just suddenly hit me. You're going to have to do the same thing over and over again. Now, if it was rewarded with XP or cool new gear, I dread having to do the same loop of Legions, Helltides, and Nightmare Dungeons for a slog of a process. I did like the game, and I feel like I got my money's worth, but I guess it's time to move on now. Now, I think it's really important to kind of highlight that last sentence. I did like the game, and I feel like I got my money's worth, but I guess it's time to move on now. This is a very, very important statement. Now, I made a video the other day talking about how if you're like angry about the game, if you're mad, if you're like insulting other people, if you're kind of, I guess you could say, in the community at large, you probably should just take a break. However, there also is another side to that, which I completely understand. And that's, I like the game. I want it to succeed. I want to play the game. But unfortunately, there's just not a couple of things that I need or want in order to continue playing the game. And that's important to highlight because a lot of people do feel like, okay, I've played the game enough. It's not worth like, $100, $200, but it is worth the price that I paid for. Some people don't feel that way. That's also fine. But it is time to move on. And this realization of not getting rewarded with XP or not getting rewarded with that like dopamine hit, I think really has to do with the pacing of the game. And again, that slog to 100, as they mentioned. Diablo 3 literally went in the opposite direction, where it's you literally get to max level in like an hour. um, and Diablo 2 is the other opposite, which is like getting to max level is like ridiculously long, even longer than Diablo 4. So Diablo 4 is kind of in that middle ground between the two Diablos, and I think you kind of displease both sides of the Diablo audience, while also, some of the newer players actually prefer Diablo 4. However, one thing is true, and that is the pacing is really, really off with the XP and with the gear generation. So when you're grinding out the game, you just hit these points where you basically sit there, and every dungeon is almost like a garage sale. Like you're going through every single trash item because every single trash item could be your next upgrade. And this seems like a cool idea. Wow, you mean I can pick up any item on the ground and it could be an upgrade? To some degree, yes. I'm talking about specifically ancestral yellow items, which are basically every item in the ground when you're beating higher tier nightmare dungeons in tier 4, right? Every monster is going to drop at least one ancestral. Every elite, rather, is basically going to drop one ancestral. So you basically do 2 nightmare dungeons, your whole inventory is full. And most of the time in other games, you just basically salvage all of them. You're looking for key upgrades. In this game, the excitement of that loot generation is completely gone because you're not like sitting there and you hit, oh man, this is a prime, this is a legendary, this is something really, really exciting. I know it because I can see it literally just from the act of dropping it. There's no dopamine hit like that. It's literally, like I said, just a garage sale or a thrift store where you're rolling through. Oh, does this have the right stats? Does this have the right stats? And some people like that, but I think most people do not because they prefer that excitement of the loot. And Diablo 4 just kind of takes that away with the act of pacing the game where you hit the world tier 3 and all the loot is the same, or hit world tier 4 and all the loot is the same essentially. Even with the XP as well, because you're grinding, you hit world tier 3, and then what's actually interesting is because of the changes to the open world, all of the XP in the open world just goes straight down into the dumpster after you hit the kind of level cap for world tier 3 and world tier 4. And what I mean by level cap is once you're 5 levels above the expected level, I believe it's 56 for world tier 3 and 76 for world tier 4, you actually start losing XP when you kill monsters in the open world, which is kind of awkward, which means they kind of force you into every other content that's not open world. So Legion events, standard dungeons, anything in the open world besides Helltide zones and Nightmare dungeons basically don't give you XP. And then the XP is already pretty slow with all the nerfs. I think these two combine to basically tell you, yeah, the vast majority of people will never hit 100. And it's not necessarily because they don't have the time as well. There is going to be a vast majority of people that can't do it because they don't have the time. Yeah, we know that. But considering like Eternal Realm characters that can farm forever, right? And they don't get reset. Even those players that may not have a ton of time, they just don't do it or they won't reach level 100 because they don't want to. And they don't want to grind that end slog. I think Diablo 4 oftentimes is the most fun between 1 to 75. And then as soon as you hit about 75, you kind of have your build online. And unless you plan on changing up your build, well, it's going to be the same exact content with the same exact build, with the same exact goal for the next 100 hours, 50 hours, or whatever it is. I think it's like 50 hours if you're not super efficient. So kind of just some thoughts on that. And I think that with the XP changes coming up soon, I think this is actually something that's going to be really, really good. But I really, really wish they would do something with the loot. Not necessarily itemization, because I know some people focus on the itemization and like the actual stats of things and the way you're building your character. I actually think the problem is within the actual loot generation and the loot gathering rather than the actual items themselves. But perhaps those are two in the same, and you can't change one without the other. But curious to hear your thoughts. And whether or not you are even close to 100 or you will ever be reaching level 100. Thanks for watching. and I'll see you all for the next one.